My name's Laura Kendrick. I was 34 the summer we disappeared. Jake and I had been married for 5 years. We lived just outside Worcester, Massachusetts in a little rental with creaky floors and wildflowers that grew too fast in the backyard. I was working on my master's in environmental science. Jake was freelancing weddings, real estate shoots, the occasional gallery print that sold just enough to keep the lights on. We were happy, mostly. But that spring, something had shifted. We were missing each other in the in-between moments, passing like ghosts in our own house. I buried myself in research. Jake disappeared for days, chasing light across state lines. We weren't fighting, not exactly. Just forgetting how to laugh. That's when I suggested the road trip. Route 6, coast to coast, Massachusetts to California. 2 weeks of back roads, mom-and-pop motels, no chain restaurants, no conference calls. Just paper maps, gas station coffee, and the kind of towns you'd miss if you blinked. We called it our reset. I packed my notebooks. Jake packed his Polaroid. We left on June 15th. Jake behind the wheel, me cross-legged in the passenger seat with the map across my lap and a cooler full of sandwiches between us. The first few days were magic. In Ohio, we met a waitress who'd been working the same counter since 1987. She called us honeymooners and sent us off with pie. Jake took her photo by the window, the morning light catching the silver in her hair. In Missouri, we stayed at a roadside motel where the owner's dog followed us around like a shadow. I filled my journal with plant samples and Jake's dumb jokes. He filled his camera with sunsets and my bare feet in gravel parking lots. By the time we reached Colorado, the mountains were starting to feel like something sacred. I remember Jake pulling over without a word, setting up his tripod just to catch the way the mist rolled across a field of wild sage. We were getting back to something. I could feel it. On June 22nd, we rolled into a town called Clear Creek. Just a dot on the map, maybe 800 people. One diner, one gas station, and a place called the Valley Pines Motel. It had that horseshoe shape you only see in old postcards, cabins with screen doors and flower boxes nailed to the windows. The kind of place where the ice machine still takes quarters and the air smells like pine and dust. Our room was number 12. I remember posing with Jake outside, the sun in our eyes, his arm warm around my shoulders. He posted it on Instagram that night, mountains and good company. Last push tomorrow to Utah. We were supposed to leave the next morning, but something felt off that night. Not loud, not violent, just off. I remember the sound of footsteps, a shadow moving past the curtain, too slow to be casual. And then, just before midnight, I sent Sarah a message. Nothing dramatic, just one line. "I don't like the way that guy in the lobby keeps looking at us." She never saw it until the next day. By then, it was already too late. Danny, the college kid working the desk that night, said he showed up for his morning shift right at 7. Our parking space in front of cabin 12 was empty. Blue Civic gone. Curtains drawn. No key on the counter. Nothing that raised alarms. Most travelers leave early, especially in a town like Clear Creek. Beat the sun. Catch the views. But by mid-morning, housekeeping went to clean the room. When no one answered, they used the spare key. The room was quiet, clean. A little too clean. Bed made tight. Nothing on the nightstand. 2 coffee cups in the sink still wet. A dark patch in the carpet near the window that someone had tried to blot dry. No suitcases, no jackets, not even a receipt. It was like we were never there. Danny said he called Jake's number first. No answer. Then mine. Straight to voicemail. They must have left early, he told Sarah later. It happens. But Sarah knew better. She said it out loud to the dispatcher when she called that night. Emily doesn't leave early. Not unless she has to. And she always calls. Always. By the next morning, my parents were calling the motel directly. Sarah kept pressing, when had we checked out? Did anyone see us drive away? Danny stuck to his story. Around dawn, probably, just like any other guest. But we weren't like any other guests. I hated mornings. Everyone in my life knew that. I wasn't up at dawn unless something had gone wrong. When Clear Creek police finally took the report, it landed on Chief Harlan's desk. He'd been with the department 15 years. Mostly petty thefts, fender benders, town kids drinking behind the old fire station. Missing tourists weren't common, and when they did happen, they were usually cleared up in a day or two. A couple gets lost hiking. Phone dies. They show up sheepish at a gas station. This was different. On June 25th, 2 days after that last photo, the Civic turned up. 12 miles outside town, parked at a trailhead into the Rocky Mountain wilderness. A ranger had seen it the day before, but assumed someone was backpacking. But the doors were locked. Keys gone. No tent inside, no camping gear. Jake's backup camera bag was in the back seat. My hiking boots were on the floor. That's when it hit the chief that this wasn't just a mix-up. He told reporters later, "People don't head into the mountains without boots." He was right. Those boots were broken in laced for miles. I wouldn't have left them behind unless something stopped me. Search teams fanned out for days. K9 units, volunteers, choppers with heat sensors. Nothing. Not a print, not a wrapper, not a broken branch. It was like we never stepped onto that trail, like the car drove itself. Police went back to the motel. They interviewed every guest still in town. Most were families or couples passing through. Nobody saw anything unusual. Nobody heard anything strange. Except for one. Mrs. Henderson, 72, from Fort Collins, room 10. She said she heard voices from our cabin around 10:30 that night. Not yelling exactly, just something sharp. A man's voice, then mine, then his again. Couldn't make out the words, but she knew the rhythm, the weight in it. That wasn't a casual conversation, she told the officers. I've been married 43 years. You learn the sound of trouble. She also heard footsteps later, quick ones, rushed, across the walkway outside her window. By the time she got to the peephole, they were gone. Sarah clung to my final message. She said it again and again to anyone who would listen. She said, "That guy in the lobby." Not a guy. That guy. That means she noticed him. That means he stood out. But the lobby was barely more than a counter and a coffee pot. And Danny, the night clerk, swore up and down he hadn't seen us after we checked in. Said he was in the back watching TV. No one else came in. Maybe she meant another guest, he offered. But the registry only showed 5 occupied cabins that night. Police tracked them all down. All accounted for. That's when Sarah brought in someone else. A retired detective from Denver. Marcus Flynn. She found his name through a friend at the university. He'd worked missing persons for 20 years. Private now. She paid him out of her own savings. Said she'd never forgive herself if she didn't try everything. Flynn came to Clear Creek, met with the chief, walked the motel grounds. He talked to staff, read the reports, looked through our photos and journal entries. Then he asked a question no one else had thought to ask. Has this happened before? Chief Harlan started to say no, then stopped. Not here, maybe. Not exactly. But once Flynn started digging, the map changed. Michael Torres, 2003. College student headed to Utah. Last seen at a motel 40 miles west of Clear Creek. His car turned up a week later abandoned. No sign of him. Lisa and David Reeves, 2007. Young couple from Texas. Disappeared from a budget motel in Millfield. Their RV found 3 towns over. Rachel Martinez, 2011. Traveling nurse. Vanished from Pine Ridge. Her sedan showed up in a grocery store parking lot 60 miles away. Mark and Jennifer Walsh, 2014. Motel in Cedar Falls. Gone. Flynn laid it all out. 8 disappearances in 15 years. All along Route 6. All young. All travelers. Every single one last seen checking into a small, family-run motel. Cars always found days later, always someplace strange. Not crashed, not stripped, just left. It wasn't random. Not anymore. Then came the company name, Rocky Mountain Services. On paper, it was just a regional maintenance outfit. Plumbing, pest control, key systems. They serviced motels up and down Route 6. Dozens of them. All the ones on Flynn's list. Owned by a man named Thomas Briggs. 62. Lived alone in a cabin outside Cedar Falls. Worked solo. Quiet. Unremarkable. He had access. Keys. Schedules. Knew which cabins were empty. Knew when guests arrived when they left. Perfect camouflage. When the FBI tried to reach him, he was already gone. Phone disconnected. Bank accounts emptied. Neighbors hadn't seen him in months. His truck was missing. His cabin swept clean. Like he was never there. There was no arrest. No charges. No body. Just a name. A shadow across a map of 8 red pins and too many unanswered calls. We weren't the first. That much was clear. But for a long time it seemed like we might be the last. Then 5 years later, a demolition crew walked into an abandoned lodge in Millbrook. Back room. Padlocked door. Rusted shut. And sitting inside the dark sealed space was a trunk. Not just any trunk. The kind built for transport. For secrecy. For keeping something or someone from ever being found. When the news first broke about the other disappearances along Route 6, I thought it would finally mean something was going to happen. Not just for us, for Jake and me, but for all of them. For the college kid in 2003, the nurse from Pine Ridge, the honeymoon couple whose RV was found abandoned with their wedding album still inside. 8 names. 8 stories cut off in the middle. The pattern was there. The link was there. We weren't imagining it. And yet even then, even with the maps and the timelines and the names pinned to the same stretch of highway, people hesitated. The media called it a mystery. Law enforcement called it circumstantial. Danny, the desk clerk, said we were probably just lost hikers. Chief Harlan told Sarah that tourists sometimes wanted to disappear. People have their reasons, he said. Sarah didn't accept that. Neither did my parents. They said I would have called. I would have found a payphone, a gas station, a ranger, anything. I was always the cautious one. I never just disappeared. But the doubt set in anyway. Little by little, like water under a door. First came the headlines, couple vanishes on cross-country trip. Then the speculation. Maybe we had an accident. Maybe we ran away. People online started filling in the blanks, turning our last photo into 100 different theories. Strangers pulled quotes from my journal and decided we'd been in trouble long before Clear Creek. Some said Jake had done something to me. Others said I'd done something to him. One woman claimed she'd seen us in Arizona 6 months later. That her neighbor had taken us in and we'd changed our names. She described a dog we didn't own. A town we'd never visited. And people believed her. Sarah did everything she could to keep our names from getting twisted. She gave interviews. She begged reporters to focus on the facts. She posted the same photo every week, Jake's arm around me, that last motel in the background, and wrote underneath, "My sister didn't just vanish. Someone took her. Some listened. Some didn't. The police had no body, no weapon, no motive. Just a car left in the woods and 2 cups in a sink." I think what hurt the most was the silence. Not from the people who loved us, but from everyone else. How quickly the story faded once there was nothing new to print. Jake's dad said it was like shouting into fog. Every day he called the Clear Creek station, left messages, asked if there was anything new. Sometimes Chief Harlan answered. Sometimes he didn't. Eventually, the FBI team assigned to our case got moved, reassigned. Their phone numbers stopped working. The flyers came down. The coverage dried up. And the motel we disappeared from went back to business as usual. Danny moved on too. He stopped answering Sarah's calls. Told the Denver Post he'd done everything right. That he wasn't even on duty when things went bad. Said he barely remembered us. But I know he did. I know he remembered the key that was never turned in the wet spot by the window, the shift in the air after we checked in and never came out. Sarah never let go of what I'd texted her. That guy in the lobby. It wasn't just a feeling. She kept saying that. It was a warning, a thread, a clue. But no one pulled it. We weren't loud people, Jake and me. We didn't make scenes. We weren't the type to draw attention or leave trails of trouble behind us. We planned. We prepared. And because of that, I think some people assumed we must have walked into whatever happened that night willingly, like it was a decision. But it wasn't. We were chosen, watched, targeted. And when it mattered most, when we needed someone to believe what we said, it was too easy for the world to say maybe we just left. I think that's what Sarah struggled with most. Not just losing us, but being the only one left to explain who we really were. She printed everything. Journal entries, photos, gas station receipts. All of it in binders. She mapped our entire route. She traced every mile on paper. Showed people where we stopped, who we spoke to, what we ordered at diners. She recreated the trip so fully that at one point the lead investigator from the FBI told her she knew more about our disappearance than the Bureau did. And still it wasn't enough. The motel registry only had 5 other names that night. All interviewed, all cleared. No signs of forced entry, no cameras on the property, no record of a maintenance visit. No one remembered anyone unusual. No license plates stood out. But someone had been there. Someone who made me uneasy enough to send that message. Someone who walked past our door more than once. Someone who waited. Flynn. The private investigator said patterns like this don't come out of nowhere. He said whoever was responsible had probably tested the waters before. Smaller risks, unnoticed acts, things that didn't make the news. He said people like this hide in plain sight. They learn how to be useful, how to stay close without standing out, and when they move, it's clean, quiet, almost polite. He showed Sarah maps of other missing persons cases, gaps in coverage, unsolved files from rural counties with budget cuts and rotating staff. He said we'd never know how many victims there really were. That was the hardest part, the not knowing. By the end of 2019, Jake and I were still gone. Our parents stopped holding out for good news. They started using words like closure and acceptance. They packed away the photos. They canceled our phones. But Sarah didn't. She kept my number active. Said she couldn't bring herself to delete the last message. She left it starred. She left it alone. Then in early 2023, 5 years after that last night in Clear Creek, someone called her from a number she didn't recognize. A demolition crew had found something sealed in the back of a shuttered motel a few hundred miles west. The building had been closed for years, scheduled to be torn down. But behind a padlocked door in a dust-covered utility room, they found a trunk. Metal, heavy, with stains that didn't belong. Inside, they said, was something that finally answered the question Sarah had been asking since that summer. Not just what happened to us, but how many others were never believed. The trunk had been sealed for years. Heavy-duty padlock rust along the hinges' ventilation holes drilled clean through and covered with mesh. The storage room it was found in was bolted from the outside somewhere near the back of the Red Haven Lodge, a place long forgotten, boarded up when the highway moved and the guests stopped coming. The demolition team thought it was just old plumbing supplies, or maybe old paperwork. But the moment the padlock came off, the air shifted, the kind of stillness that tells you no one's supposed to be there, and something was left behind that shouldn't have been. Inside, they found my journal. The leather cover, warped from moisture corners, curled like it had been held shut by weight and time. Jake's vintage film camera was tucked next to it, the one he only used on special trips. The flower crown I'd made for a photo in Missouri was still there, dry, brittle, flattened under a layer of dust. His sneakers soaked through and stained dark in places. And at the bottom, sealed in plastic bags, were other things. Not ours. Belongings that didn't match our photos or our route or our lives. Different names, different disappearances. Everything carefully placed like pieces in a story no one ever meant to tell. Agent Wells was the one who opened the trunk. She'd worked homicides, abductions, organized crime 20 years in, and she said it was the quietest evidence room she'd ever stood in. Nobody spoke when they laid everything out on the table. You didn't need to. The items said enough. They'd been packed with care, some marked, some tagged, some folded like someone planned to return to them. It wasn't chaos. It was deliberate, precise. The last page in my journal was written in my handwriting, but not the way I usually wrote. It was quick, shaky, like I wasn't sure how much time I had. I'd written that something felt wrong, that Jake thought I was being paranoid, that we'd seen the same man 3 times in one day, first at the diner, then at the gas station, and again at the front desk of the Valley Pines Motel. I said he was staring, not watching, but studying, the kind of stare you don't forget once you've felt it. I wrote that I'd heard footsteps pass our door, not once but multiple times. They'd pause, then keep going. And I ended that entry with a sentence I never finished. The photo roll in Jake's camera hadn't survived well. Most of it was streaked with damaged long stretches of light and blur. But 6 frames had something the lab could pull. 3 were snapshots from the trip me by a roadside attraction, a cornfield sunset, the town sign for Clear Creek. Then came the 4th photo taken through our cabin window, looking out into the parking lot. The security light cast just enough glow to show our car, and a dark pickup parked a few spaces down. 5th photo was angled low, blurry, like the camera had been held close to Jake's chest. You could make out the hallway, just the edge of it, and a shape at the far end too far to identify but human. Waiting maybe, or listening. The 6th photo caught someone mid-step, a man larger build walking straight toward the lens. His face was lost to grain, but his posture was sure. There was something metallic in his hand. Could have been keys. Could have been something else. The timestamp said 2:17 a.m. That was the same morning Danny the motel clerk would later tell police he assumed we'd checked out early, that we must have left before sunrise. But our car wasn't seen again until 2 days later, and we weren't in it. The blood in the trunk was ours. They tested forensics twice to be sure. The lab said the volume found inside meant severe injury, likely fatal, but there were other DNA samples as well. Older, degraded, tied to 2 other missing persons cases from over a decade earlier. Michael Torres, Lisa Reeves. Their names hadn't been spoken aloud in years. But now they were in the system again, tied to one object. One man. The fingerprint found under the lid wasn't in any database, no military record, no arrest history, no employment background that required vetting. Whoever left it had stayed clear of every system designed to track people. But there was a number etched into the steel edge of the trunk, a manufacturing code. The serial traced back to a military surplus supplier in Wyoming, dated 1987. The modifications inside the loops for restraints, the false bottom, the reinforced edges, those weren't part of any standard design. They were added later. Welded in, purpose-built. This wasn't improvisation. This was routine. Wells ordered a deep audit of every motel linked to Route 6 between Cedar Falls and Millbrook. Most had changed ownership, some demolished. But a few still had records, invoices, repair logs, supply contracts, and the same company kept showing up. Rocky Mountain Services, operated by one man, Thomas Briggs. They found an old work order from 2009 light fixture replacement at Sunset Motor Court. The notes were signed T. Briggs in careful block lettering. Another invoice from Pine Ridge showed charges for custom lock installations billed under the same business. The motels varied, but the access didn't. Briggs had no criminal record, no family. His last known address was a cabin outside Cedar Falls. When agents arrived, the place was cleared out. Blank walls, empty drawers, no photos, no food in the fridge. But in the basement, behind a panel in the wall, they found a map. Red pins for every disappearance. Yellow for motels he worked at. Blue for where the cars had turned up. Jake and I were there, marked in ink. So were the others. But there were 12 names in total, and the FBI had only identified 8. There were 4 more people who'd vanished but whose cases hadn't been connected. Yet, here they were written in Briggs's hand. First names, dates, locations, each placed neatly into a sequence. Sarah asked if it was possible the others hadn't even been reported missing, that their families never came forward, that they were still out there somewhere, just a memory no one knew how to follow, and no one could say for sure. The case was reopened under federal jurisdiction. A full task force now. Resources Sarah had begged for back when she was still stapling flyers to telephone poles. The story broke nationally. Cable news, podcasts, interviews. I watched it happen the way a person watches their own face in a mirror. Distant, recognizable, but no longer yours. They called it the Route 6 disappearances. They called Jake and me the young couple who got too close. They called Briggs the quiet handyman. They said it like he was part of the backdrop, a fixture, a neutral presence. But Sarah remembered what I wrote in that journal, that he wasn't just present, he was studying us. By the end of that year, they knew he'd been watching others too, following, planning, documenting. And the only thing left to figure out was whether he was still alive to keep going, or whether somewhere in the silence between motels, he'd simply disappeared again right back into the shadows he'd always known how to use. David never stopped working the case. Even after the search teams were pulled back, even after the press stopped calling and the motel shut its doors for good, he kept going. Jake's father was a quiet man, the kind who didn't raise his voice unless something truly mattered. A software engineer by trade, the kind who could trace a problem through 1,000 lines of code until something broke open. That's how he treated what happened to us. Not like a tragedy, like a system. And systems he believed always left a trace. He started by requesting our phone records, not just the logs but the tower pings. It took months of paperwork, FOIA requests, letters to phone companies. Most families would have had no idea where to begin, but David understood how digital infrastructure worked, how signals moved, how time stamped every single thing. He built timelines on his kitchen wall maps of cell tower coverage areas layered over Route 6, thin black threads connecting ping points to dates times towers. And then he noticed something that hadn't been part of the original investigation. Our phones hadn't gone dark immediately after Clear Creek. They moved. On June 23rd, just after midnight, both phones, mine and Jake's, had pinged the tower nearest Valley Pines. That matched what we knew. But then, between 12:15 and 3 a.m., they hit 5 additional towers moving steadily west, 37 miles in all. Not a random drift, not a GPS error. They were traveling, together, in motion, and the route they took ended near one place, the same place the trunk was eventually found. Red Haven Lodge. The timestamp of the last phone ping, 2:43 a.m., lined up almost exactly with the 6th photo Jake had taken in the hallway, the figure approaching the camera, the metallic shape in his hand. We never left that motel alive, but our phones did. And someone was driving them. David printed the signal map and brought it to the FBI field office himself. They double-checked the logs, verified the movement. It wasn't a dead end anymore. It was a path, not just to the trunk, but to every place it had been before it landed in that storage room. He went further than that. He layered in tower data from the other disappearances, the ones Marcus Flynn had found. Not all the records had survived, but a few had, enough to see the pattern. Different years, different towns, but sometimes the phones followed the same stretch of road, passed the same motels, hit the same towers in the same sequence. That's when the task force began re-examining the locations, not the crime scenes, but the buildings. The places that never made it into the headlines. Old motor courts, abandoned inns, shuttered roadside motels with roofs falling in and vines climbing through the windows. Not just where victims were last seen, but where they might have been taken after. Held. Moved. hidden. Sunset Valley Motor Lodge had been closed since 2006. When investigators entered, they found signs of recent occupancy. Sleeping bags, canned food, a small radio tuned to weather frequencies. Desert Winds Motel had its doors chained shut, but inside the manager's office was a filing cabinet full of notes. Guest logs dating back years, not government records, handwritten ones. Names, dates, vehicle descriptions. And next to some of those names, small red X's. Pine Ridge Inn had a basement. Most people didn't know that. The stairs were narrow, unfinished. Down there they found a small workshop, tools arranged with care. Lockpicks, blank key cards, glue-on license plates, everything organized by type by size. The air smelled like motor oil and rust. Briggs hadn't just moved from place to place. He'd built a system. He'd taken the forgotten corners of old highway America, the places most people pass by without stopping, and turned them into something else. Places to wait, to store, to observe. The motels weren't scenes of desperation. They were infrastructure. No one had ever connected them before because they'd all fallen off the map years ago. The state didn't inspect them. The counties didn't care. They were too far from the interstates, too far from everything. Wells called it his net, the places he trusted, the ones he could disappear into. Each location was stripped of identifiers, no personal items, no fingerprints, no paper trails. But they all had one thing in common: at some point they'd been serviced by Rocky Mountain Services. He wasn't just a predator, he was a builder, someone who'd been laying down pieces of a larger plan for 20 years. What chilled David the most was how long it had gone unnoticed, how carefully the digital footprint had been erased. But the thing about systems is even the best ones have weaknesses. David found another. It wasn't in a tower log, it wasn't in a journal, it was in the pauses. On the map showing our final phone route, Clear Creek to Red Haven, there were delays. The signal wasn't constant. At two separate points, the phones had stopped moving for more than 15 minutes. Both stops lined up with other motels, ones linked to older cases. At first, it didn't make sense. If we were being moved, why stop? Why linger? Wells had a theory. She said it wasn't just transportation, it was ritual. She'd seen it before in long-haul offenders. They revisited places, returned to scenes. It was about control, about memory. And if that was true, then Briggs hadn't just taken us somewhere to hide us. He was taking a route, one he'd taken before. David circled the pause points in red ink. He said something had happened there, that maybe we were still alive at that point, that maybe he'd stopped to think, or to look, or to remember. The possibilities were unbearable, but they mattered, because they proved movement. They proved intention. The investigation changed after that. It stopped being about looking for bodies. It became about mapping a pattern, understanding the mind behind it. And that's when they found the cabin. Not Briggs's home outside Cedar Falls. That had been wiped clean. This was another one. Remote. No address. Just a set of GPS coordinates found on a scrap of paper hidden behind a mirror in Pine Ridge. The cabin was deeper into the hills, barely reachable by road. And in the back room they found a ledger. Wells opened it with gloves. Each page had a date, a town, a room number, then a first name. Ours was there, Clear Creek, room 12. Jake, Emily. The last entry in that ledger was dated 3 weeks after we vanished. It was a name no one recognized, but the town listed was one the team hadn't checked yet, and the motel, like all the others, had been closed for years. The name in the ledger was Jamie Carter. The town listed was Maple Hollow, a speck of a place in northern Nevada, no stoplight, no sheriff's department, not even a proper gas station. Just a main street, a grain elevator, and an old roadside motel boarded up since 2008. Wells checked the missing persons database 3 times. No one by that name had ever been reported missing. But there it was, the final entry. A name that didn't officially exist connected to a motel that had slipped through every crack in the system. The team sent 2 agents to check it out. The kind of assignment that feels procedural at first. Walk the property, document the layout, look for signs of forced entry. Just another dead location in a long string of them. But when they got there, they found tire tracks. Not new, but not weathered over either. Something heavy had rolled through the gravel lot in the last few months. And the front door, while chained, had been recently reinforced with a padlock same kind used at Red Haven. No power, no lights. But inside the lobby, someone had left a lantern, and next to it a notebook. Most of the pages were blank. A few had sketches, maps, diagrams, a list of vehicle types, some motel names crossed out, a few phrases repeated. Night watch. Keys by sound. Don't stay too long. The handwriting matched what they'd seen in the cabin. Same pressure, same lean. This wasn't a copycat. This was him, and he'd been there. Wells flew in the next morning. She walked the building herself, every room, every doorway. And when she reached the maintenance shed out back, she stopped. There was a mark carved into the door frame, 3 vertical lines with a 4th crossing through. Same symbol they'd found on a wood panel in the Pine Ridge basement. They opened the shed and found a cot, a portable heater, a water canister, trash bags with food wrappers, a camera tripod. No photos, no batteries, just the stand. He'd been watching something, or waiting. They took soil samples from behind the shed. Shallow dig, not a full excavation. It came back clean. No blood. No clothing fibers. But the logs inside the fire pit told another story. Burned paper half intact. Pieces of a printed map. Route 6 once again. A stretch between Millbrook and Cedar Falls circled in thick ink. Someone had tried to burn it, but not very well. It had rained recently. The fire hadn't taken. What remained was enough. Wells sent the pages to David. He scanned them for pattern anomalies markers, pixel offsets, metadata, anything to suggest when they were printed. It came back with a 2022 timestamp. So Briggs was alive, or at least someone was using his materials less than a year before the trunk was found. That changed everything. Until then, part of the Bureau still leaned on the theory that he was long dead. Maybe buried his own trail. But this placed him consciously, methodically back in motion. No electronics found on site. No camera cards. No prints. Whoever was there had time to leave the scene clean. But they hadn't erased it. They'd moved on before finishing. That was the first sign something had shifted. The task force re-examined the last place Briggs had officially lived, his known cabin near Cedar Falls. They'd gone over it in the early days, but only for surface evidence. This time they brought cadaver dogs, a full team. They swept the property inch by inch. It was the attic, not the basement, that gave them the first hit. Tucked into the insulation behind a false vent, they found a cloth pouch. Inside were fragments of a driver's license. The plastic had warped from heat or chemical exposure, but part of the name was visible. Lisa R., the same Lisa Reeves who'd vanished with her husband in 2007. They'd never found her identification before. It hadn't been in the trunk, which meant Briggs had kept it for years. And it had stayed in the cabin even after he fled. That pouch was the thread they needed. It shifted the scope again. The search wasn't just about where he'd gone, it became about what he'd left behind. Patterns, yes. Maps, yes. But also mementos, things that tied him to victims, tiny items, small enough to carry, small enough to hide. They went back through everything: unmatched artifacts, old motel storage rooms, bagged evidence no one had connected to any victim yet. One item stood out: a metal hairpin found under a radiator at the Desert Winds property. It had been dismissed. Generic. Not worth processing at the time. But with new imaging tech, they pulled a partial fingerprint from the inner curve, and it matched the same print found inside the trunk. Still no ID, still no match in any system. But it was his. That print had touched at least 3 scenes: Red Haven, Desert Winds, and the inside of a woman's wallet retrieved from a trash bag in 2011, long before any of this had been considered connected. Rachel Martinez. That wallet had been found 60 miles from where her car was left. No suspect ever named. Until now. Each thread pulled another one loose. The net widened. More jurisdictions came forward. More cold cases reopened. In all, they tallied 16 disappearances along the corridor now. 12 confirmed. 4 under review. All within the same window. All tied by pattern, place, and silence. But still no Briggs. Wells called in retired agents, analysts who'd handled interstate fugitives. They started scanning for aliases, false identities, credit histories that went dead in 2018 and then flickered back to life. One hit came from Nevada. A truck stop outside Carson City. A parking ticket issued in late 2019 to a vehicle registered under the name Robert Mitchell. On paper, Mitchell had died 4 years earlier, but the photo on the citation grainy low light showed a man resembling Briggs. Longer beard, thinner, wearing glasses, but the ears, jawline, and neck matched. The van he'd been driving was dark blue windows, tinted no commercial markings. Paid in cash. Ticket never contested. But the VIN number was still visible. They traced it to a used lot in Utah, purchased with a fake license and a prepaid debit card. The trail went cold again. Until 2 months later, when a clerk in Eureka, California remembered selling camping gear to a man who looked just like the poster on her break room bulletin board. He bought enough food and supplies for a 6-month stretch. Filters, gasoline containers, freeze-dried meals. Cash only. Said he was prepping for fire season. Wells had him now, not in custody, but close. They started watching the edges, the in-between towns, the places just past the highway signs where the motels weren't even listed anymore. The plan wasn't to chase him. It was to wait. Track movement. Find the pattern underneath the pattern. And then one morning in October, smoke was spotted coming from a trailer on the far end of a rundown lot outside Eureka. The lot had no number, no mailbox. But a utility pole beside it had once been tagged for service by Rocky Mountain Services. The team moved in just after dawn. They expected the place to be empty. But someone was home. The agents surrounded the trailer just after sunrise. The smoke from the chimney told them what the surveillance footage hadn't been able to confirm. Someone was inside. No lights on. No movement through the small front window. Just that steady trickle of wood smoke against the early October sky. They moved slow. Quiet. No shouting. No drawn weapons unless needed. They'd learned early in the case that this man didn't run. He vanished. And if he was still willing to vanish, it wouldn't be into the woods. It would be into silence. The kind that takes years to break. Thomas Briggs stepped outside before they knocked. Hands up, wrists bare. His beard had grown down past his collar. He was thinner than the photographs. Clothes hung off him like they didn't belong to him. But he stood straight. No limp, no hesitation. When Wells approached, he didn't blink. He didn't ask why they were there. He just said, "I've been waiting," and let them cuff him without a word. Inside the trailer, they found what they expected and a few things they didn't. The place was meticulous, sparse. One burner stove, a folding chair, a sleeping pad, notebooks stacked under a tarp, Plastic bins filled with dated envelopes. No electronics, no phone, no computer. He'd lived entirely off-grid. Power came from a small solar panel rig. Water was filtered in from a nearby creek. The records he kept were handwritten columns codes inventory. But there were photos, too. Dozens of them, stashed in sealed envelopes marked by year. Jake was in some of them. So was I, and so were all the others. Victims no one had ever seen past a last gas station sighting or motel registry line. In these photos, they were smiling, looking off camera, sometimes seated in parking lots or roadside diners. A few were taken without their knowledge, angles from across a lobby, through a cracked motel room curtain. Others showed the aftermath, rooms cleaned and stripped, objects arranged, nothing graphic, just deliberate, like a collector cataloging what he'd claimed. There were journals, too, not confessions, not apologies, observations, notes about habits, luggage types, which couples locked the motel doors behind them and which didn't, who stayed for one night, who stayed for two. He called them cycles, said most people weren't missed until the third cycle. That's when they became visible. Wells read through 3 volumes before she had to step outside. I don't think it was the details that got to her. It was the calm, the way he described each step like he was writing a recipe, not out of cruelty, just routine. In custody, Briggs said almost nothing for the first 2 days. Then on day 3, he asked for coffee. Real coffee, not the kind they give you from a vending machine. When they brought it, he opened the cup, took a sip, and said, "Do you want the names or the places first?" He gave both. He listed all 12 victims, their full names, where they'd been taken from, where they'd been held, where they'd been buried. Some we already knew. Some the FBI hadn't even confirmed yet. He spoke in even tones, pausing only to clarify spellings. At no point did he ask what would happen to him, or if he was being recorded. He knew the system, and he knew it was over. The locations were remote, some overgrown. One was sealed under concrete in an abandoned septic tank. It took weeks to recover all the remains, and even then some fragments were too degraded to positively match. But the DNA that did come through confirmed everything he said. Jake and I were found in a canyon outside Moab, Utah. We'd been buried together wrapped in plastic sheeting beneath a cairn of local stone. Jake's main digital camera was buried a few feet away. The card inside was still intact. It held over 400 photos from the trip, all of them dated, cataloged. Moments no one else had seen. Moments that hadn't made it to social media or my journal or anyone's memory, but ours. My family asked that those photos be kept private, and they were. The FBI honored that. So did the press for once. They were returned to Sarah in a plain envelope. No copies made, no digital archive. Just the last days of our lives quietly handed back. Briggs led agents to every site, walked them to the exact locations, described what he'd used to dig, what time of night it had been, whether the moon was full. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He didn't resist. He just answered, like someone reading from a schedule. When asked why he paused for the first time in hours, then he said, "I liked the quiet of it." That moment after. You'd be surprised how loud most people are. But not afterward. That's when it gets quiet. No one spoke for a long time after that. He was arraigned within a week, charged with 12 counts of first-degree murder, 12 counts of unlawful imprisonment, multiple charges of conspiracy, tampering, concealment. He waived his right to trial, accepted a plea deal in exchange for full cooperation and the identification of all victims. The death penalty was taken off the table. Instead, he was sentenced to 12 consecutive life terms, no possibility of parole. At his sentencing, the courtroom was full, families from 6 different states. Some had never spoken before. Some had followed each other's cases for years without realizing they were part of the same story. Briggs sat motionless as the judge read each name. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply shook his head. He was transferred to federal custody 2 days later, held in isolation due to the nature of his crimes. No interviews allowed, no further statements made. 8 months later, he died. Heart attack, in his cell, alone. The prison issued a statement. The Bureau closed the case file, but for the families, it didn't end there. Not really. Some wanted answers Briggs hadn't given. Others didn't want to hear another word. Sarah went quiet for a while, took time off, said she needed to remember who Emily was before any of this. Not the missing girl, not the name on the news, just her sister. The one who sent postcards from every state line. The one who laughed at her own handwriting. The one who still owed her a birthday call. I think she forgave me in her own way, for not calling sooner, for not leaving sooner, for whatever I didn't do that night. But I also think she knew the truth, that I saw him, that I knew. But I still opened the door. Sarah never asked me to come back to Colorado. She didn't have to. I booked the flight 2 weeks after the sentencing and drove up the canyon the morning after I landed. Her place looked the same from the outside, cedar trim, flaking white paint, and empty bird feeder still hanging from the post. But the inside felt quieter. Not in a hollow way. More like something had settled or stopped moving. We made tea, sat on the porch, talked about the weather for too long. Then she handed me a padded envelope and said, "I want you to have this." I knew what it was before I opened it. Emily's journal. The one she always carried even when we thought she was just sketching or scribbling quotes off diner walls. I ran my thumb along the edge but didn't open it, not yet. Sarah said she'd read every page more than once, that it didn't explain everything, but it made things feel real again, like Emily had written it for someone who needed to remember she'd existed. Not just what happened to her, but how she saw the world before it narrowed down to a name on a list. Later that evening, I drove up to the trailhead where we'd parked the van that last night. The lot was empty. Same cracked gravel, same faded mileage board with half the letters scratched off. I walked the edge of the trail, but didn't go far. The air felt thinner up there, but maybe that was just me. I stood at the overlook, staring down at the valley, and tried to remember the sound of her voice. Not from the videos, not from the recordings, just her, as she was. That laugh she had when she made fun of my parking. The way she pronounced pecan wrong on purpose just to start an argument. The smallest things end up mattering the most. The next morning I met with Special Agent Wells at a cafe just outside Boulder. It wasn't official. She was already off the case. Said she wanted to return the last of our items in person. There wasn't much left. A cracked pair of sunglasses. My old hiking watch still set to the wrong time zone. Emily's keychain, the one with the miniature license plate. And the camera. I hadn't seen it since they recovered it from the burial site. The lens was still intact. A little fogged on the inside, but not broken. Wells said they'd extracted everything off the memory card and encrypted the files for the families. They were giving me the raw drive if I wanted it. I told her I wasn't ready yet. She said, "You don't have to be. Take your time." As we walked out, I asked her one question. "Do you think he was trying to tell us something by burying us together?" She paused, then said, "I think he knew what mattered to you. That's what made him dangerous." We didn't say anything else after that. Just a nod, a quiet exit. She went back to her rental car, and I stood on the sidewalk holding a camera I wasn't sure I could open. I stayed in Colorado for 4 days. Didn't tell anyone else I was there. I read through the journal a page at a time, no more than 2 or 3 each night. Emily wrote about the mundane things, the way the light hit the cliffs outside Zion, the pie at that gas station diner in Utah, how Jake always talked in his sleep, but only when he was dreaming about his dad. The last entry wasn't dated. It just said, "I think we're close to something. Not a place, maybe not even a moment, but something that means we'll never forget this." That line stuck with me. When I got back home, I printed that entry and framed it. Hung it in the hallway where I'd see it every time I passed the front door. Not as a reminder of how it ended, but of how she saw it. What it meant to her before it got taken away. About a month later, Sarah called me, said she'd found something tucked behind one of Emily's canvases. It was a small envelope marked with my name. Inside was a single photograph. The four of us at a picnic table somewhere in Arizona. I don't remember who took it. Might have been a timer shot, but we all looked tired and happy in that way only people on the road ever do. Sarah asked if I wanted it back. I told her no, that she should keep it, but if she ever decided to frame it, I wanted a copy. She laughed. First time I'd heard her do that since everything came out. It wasn't a long call, but it didn't have to be. Life didn't go back to normal after that. It just reshaped itself. I stopped trying to outrun the guilt. Stopped waking up thinking I could rewrite that night by remembering it harder. I started speaking at a few recovery groups, not officially, not as a survivor, just as someone who lived through it, who saw what people don't want to believe, that some kinds of evil don't come with warning signs, that sometimes the person who seems invisible is exactly the one who's watching you the closest. People still reach out. Friends of victims, reporters, students writing papers. I don't always answer, but when I do, I tell them what I can. That we made a mistake, that it was small, that it cost more than we could have known, but that they mattered. Emily, Jake, all the others. They mattered. And if I don't say their names, who will? The last thing Briggs ever said, at least on record, was during his transfer to federal custody. A guard asked him almost sarcastically if he wanted anything before he went. Briggs looked at him and said, "Tell them to check the locker behind the rest stop on mile 42, southbound." That location wasn't on any of the maps the FBI had. It wasn't tied to any active case. But when they followed up, they found it. There was another name, another missing person, a man no one had connected until that moment. His family had filed a report 2 years earlier. It had gone nowhere. Just another drifter, another face that didn't make the evening news. That changed everything. Because if there was one, there might have been more. The last time I drove through that stretch of highway, I passed mile 42 without meaning to. I didn't stop, didn't pull over, but I knew exactly where the rest stop sat, just beyond the bend with the half-collapsed billboard and the vending machine that never worked. The locker had already been cleared out by then. Evidence processed, family contacted, another file reopened. But for a moment I wondered what it must have felt like for that man's family to finally get a phone call they thought would never come. Maybe not peace, but at least the truth. The case against Briggs stayed closed after that. No more appeals, no new statements, just silence. I read somewhere that his defense team quietly withdrew a few months later. No reason given. I don't think they ever really believed him, not fully. He had a way of talking in circles that made everything feel true and false at once. That was his skill. Making you doubt your own clarity. Making you wonder if you'd missed something obvious. Sarah moved not long after. Said she needed to start over somewhere where people didn't know her as the sister of the missing girl. She ended up in New Mexico near the high desert. Sends a postcard every now and then. She started painting again. Landscapes mostly. Said she couldn't bring herself to do portraits yet. That part's still too close. But I think she's getting there. Healing doesn't have a clean edge to it. It just sort of changes shape depending on how the light hits. As for me, I stayed put. At first, it felt like I owed it to the others. Jake, Emily, the ones we never got to meet. But over time, it became something else. Not penance, not guilt, just presence. I started volunteering with search teams when I could. Nothing high profile. Just quiet work, mapping trails, checking fence lines, helping families understand how these things are organized. You'd be surprised how many never get a proper briefing. They just wait and wait until someone like Briggs crosses their path. I don't tell people what happened unless they ask. Some do. Most don't. But when I do, I always say the names. Slowly. Out loud. It matters. Names are what remain after the headlines fade, after the court dates pass. That's the one thing I hope anyone listening takes away. Say the names. Remember the ones who didn't get to grow older. Don't let them vanish again. Stories like this never have a perfect ending. Justice doesn't make the loss smaller. It just draws a line through the chaos so you know where it stops. What you do after, that's your part to carry. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll take a moment to share it. Say their names, speak their stories. That's how we keep the light on so no one disappears into silence. Not completely. Not ever.